Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And in last week's video I was talking about the theft, or rather thefts, of the crown jewels of the United Kingdom. In that video I made a reference to the mythology surrounding the bloodline of Edward I. From my comment section it was clear that the reference was not sufficient. Now granted, I did ask you if you wanted me to tell the story and you were very vociferous, and so as promised, here we are. Today I will be telling the story of the demon bloodline of Edward I. But before we get into that, I want to think about why storytelling is so important, and in particular why it was so important as a form of entertainment at the court of Edward I. Let's go. Let's imagine that we are able to travel back in time to the 1200s, and now we find ourselves inside a royal castle or palace, perhaps in one of the sumptuously decorated, luxurious and surprisingly comfortable royal apartments. And now we are in the company of King Edward I and his queen, Eleanor of Castile. Edward and Eleanor had married young. At the time of their marriage, Edward was 15 years old, while Eleanor was around 13. She may have still been 12, about to turn 13. The couple are commonly cited as an example of an arranged marriage that became a love match. And evidence of this love is shown by Eleanor joining her husband on crusade, and by her behaviour while they were together there. In 1272, while the couple were on crusade, an assassin burst into Edward's tent. He was brandishing a poisoned blade, and Edward was wounded. Nevertheless, because of his size, strength and power, he was able to disable and kill the assassin, but the injury was still there. Despite, no doubt, an understandable terror, Eleanor is said to have rushed to her husband's aid and sucked the poison from the wound, saving his life. We don't think this is actually what happened. We believe that Edward was indeed poisoned, but that he was cured successfully by his physicians. But the fact that this story was allowed to grow, and in many ways perhaps was even favoured by the royal couple themselves, is yet more evidence, as far as I'm concerned, of the importance of myth and storytelling around this royal couple. During their marriage, Eleanor would fall pregnant many times. The exact number of pregnancies is disputed, and it's believed that these pregnancies resulted in between 16 or 17 births. 6 of these children would survive into adulthood, including one boy, the heir to his father's throne, the future Edward II. Edward II's life, reign, eventual deposition and rumoured brutal end would eventually, centuries later, be immortalised in the play that bore his name, written by Christopher Marlowe. When Eleanor of Castile died at 48 years old in the year 1290, her husband Edward I was left bereft. She had died near Lincoln, but Edward wanted her buried at Westminster. Eleanor's embalmed body travelled in an honourable procession. The funeral cortege made a number of overnight stops, and Edward commanded that each of these stops should be marked with a carved stone memorial cross. 12 were constructed, 3 now survive. Of the lost examples, perhaps the most famous is the cross at Charing, from which, unsurprisingly, Charing Cross takes its name. This cross was removed on parliamentary orders during the Civil War. I have been led to believe that when you see a sign showing a distance to London, Charing Cross is what it's aiming for. However, perhaps we might imagine ourselves in their company during happier times. Maybe when they were paying a visit to their children at Windsor Castle, or in the newly built chambers of St Thomas's at the Tower of London. Perhaps while they were examining the building work in one of the castles in the north of Wales. In April 1284, Eleanor was at Carnarvon Castle, or at least in the building site that would become that castle, when she gave birth to the future Edward II, which is one of the reasons that, as a prince, he was known as Edward of Carnarvon. Now, as we are in the company of the King and Queen, we want to make sure that they are royally entertained, so that our own time at court is not a boring one, and also because royal preference can reap rewards. Then, as now, Storytelling and music making, both separately and combined, were favoured forms of entertainment. After all, Edward I's own great-grandmother, another Eleanor, but this time of Aquitaine rather than Castile, was the so-called Queen of the Troubadours. Their performed lyric love poetry was often set to music. Edward I and Eleanor of Castile were fascinated by myths and stories. In 1278, the couple went to Glastonbury Abbey to see the opened tomb that was believed to contain the earthly remains of King Arthur and his wife Guinevere. Some assert that this royal couple also led the ceremony of reburying Arthur and Guinevere beneath the altar at that abbey. Edward I even had his very own version of the Round Table made, and he would use Arthurian legend as an inspiration for aspects of his rule. It's there, in his diplomacy, conquest, and celebration. Thus, perhaps we might also imagine that he would enjoy fantastical tales of his own direct lineage. Could the story of his demonic bloodline be just one example? Well, I think I've kept you waiting long enough. Thank you for your patience. But before I jump into the story, there is just one caveat, I promise. There are many versions of this myth. The one that I'm telling happens to be my favourite. So, with all that being said, I have one final question. Are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then I'll begin. King Edward I belonged to the Plantagenet family, who themselves were descended from the Counts of Anjou. Many, many years before the birth of King Edward I, a Count of Anjou found himself desperately lonely, terribly sad that he was as yet unmarried. One day, as luck would have it, when he was out hunting in a forest, he came to a clearing, and in that clearing he encountered the most beautiful, most ravishing, most compelling woman he had ever set eyes on. He didn't even know her name, much less anything of her background, but he decided at once that she would become his wife and countess. Sure enough, the Count would do just that. He took her home with him and made her his wife and countess. Together they would have 4 children, and by all accounts the countess was popular with the Count's friends and his people. But it wasn't long before rumours started. It seemed that all was not well. Every Sunday, as was the custom and to be expected, the new countess would attend church. However, it wasn't long before people started to notice that she never stayed till the end. In fact, she would always leave before the most holy moment of the service, and she never took communion. Her husband, still completely besotted, hadn't even noticed, but eventually his close friends pointed it out to him. He dismissed it, but said, nevertheless, stop her next time. When the next Sunday rolled around, sure enough, as the host was being elevated, the countess started to leave. One of the Count's knights got in her way. She dodged him and moved around. Another stood up to block her path. She moved past him too. Eventually, one came from behind her and stepped on the back of her cloak. She struggled. She struggled some more. Eventually, she started to become quite frantic and frenetic. We are approaching the most holy moment of the service, and then she falls to her knees and lets out an unearthly, bestial roar. From beneath her cloak, out pops one clawed foot, and then another. The cloak shakes and shudders, and the growling continues until eventually what used to be the countess stands up, and she is a demon, part lizard seemingly. She picks up in her claws 2 of her sons and flies away, never to be seen again. But don't you remember? She gave the Count of Anjou 4 sons, so 2 remained behind. And one of them is the ancestor of Edward I and the whole Plantagenet line. And through them, through their mutual ancestor, it is believed that this Countess of Anjou's demon blood still flows. But what do you think? As always, I'd love to see your thoughts and read your discussions in the comments section beneath this video. Or you can come and find me over on my social media. I'll be leaving links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to the channel, and while you're there, hit the notification bell next to the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.